All right, folks, let's have everybody grab a seat. We'll get started. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Let's have folks get a seat. We'll get started. My name is Tim Hunt. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. I am also the very proud father of a 19-year-old son with a rare neurological condition called Dandy-Walker syndrome. Welcome to JP Morgan. Welcome to Biotech Showcase. And welcome to our State of the Industry briefing. I was just saying to Laura and Jancy on our team, sometime, some years ago, somebody figured out, it might have been them, it might have been my predecessor, that this is a great piece of real estate to take over for JP Morgan and an 8 o'clock start Pacific time. So I've benefited from that a lot. I think it is a great way to start JP Morgan. I get a lot of energy out of it. I know a lot of people feel terrific about it as well. We have a really good lineup today. I'll speak for about a half an hour about some reflections on the field and where we are. We'll turn it over to Peter Marks, who will beam in remotely from FDA headquarters for 30 minutes. He'll give us some insights as to what they're up to at the FDA. And then we've got a great panel on the capital markets and commercial insights that I think people will really enjoy. That will be moderated by, many people know, Whitney Igem, the Managing Director and Senior Biotech Analyst at Canaccord Genuity. Jim Birkenau, Chair and Global Co-Head of Barclays Investment Banking, will join us, as will Keith Crandall, Co-Founder and Managing Director at Arch. Linnell Hoke, President of the Cell Therapy Organization at BMS, and Kinnari Patel, President, Head of R&D, and Chief Operating Officer. Can you add any more titles into one person? She's at Rocket Pharma. It'll be a great panel. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, for those of you that aren't familiar with ARM, we're a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. We've got over 400 members, and they're anything from small private biotech companies to public biotech companies up to global pharmaceutical companies. We have a few dozen prominent academic and medical research centers, tools and service providers, organizations, strategic service providers, and a few dozen patient organizations, mostly rare disease patient organization. And the one unifying theme is we're just very all focused on what? Cell and gene therapy. And then our focus is really around convening the sector, advancing the field through data and analytics. I'll show some data in this presentation. Engaging key stakeholders, advancing the field, the development of these advanced therapies. And a lot of that is, I like to joke, we're trying to grab, kicking and screaming into the 21st century, a lot of aspects of the sort of structural barriers within healthcare. And then, we really like to think our kind of mantra internally and externally is patients are our North Star, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So my talk is sort of around how the field is continuing to evolve into what we see as an extremely bright future, and I've got 4 components of it today. So people may remember last year when I got up and spoke at JP Morgan, there was a lot of questions sort of through 2023 on like the pricing model, right? Like $2 to $3 million for gene therapy, it's so much money, it's a lot, and how are payers going to react? And all fair questions, right? So I gave as a guide the experience of Genzyme, right? So if you go rewind the clock back to 1991, 1992, they priced Cerezyme, Ceridase for Gaucher syndrome at $300,000 a year, which was like outrageous, right? Like really disruptive. And what did we see? Over the intervening few years, they worked that through the system, and it inspired other organizations like Biogen, where I was later in the 2000s, the Amgens, the Genentechs, and I think it was a catalyst for thinking about rare diseases and biotechnology, a constructive catalyst. So I've got another analog I'll use in just a moment. We'll talk about, there are some questions, very legitimate questions about the commercialization model. We'll give some perspective on that. I'll talk about the pipeline and the bright future of things that are coming. And then new opportunities with the new administration. We're going to read plenty, you probably already have, and I promise you will continue to read plenty about, from some, the sky is falling, the new Congress, the new administrations, it's all bad. And I'm just going to try to provide a little bit of fair balance to that, to what I think we will almost certainly read. Okay, history as a guide. So a lot of times I hear, and probably many of you hear, there's some similarities, some parallels to, with cell and gene therapy to monoclonal antibodies. And so we went back in time and kind of put together a couple of timelines. So one is, like, if you go back, beginning in the kind of the early to mid 1970s, right? You see the first monoclonal antibodies being put together, right? You go forward a decade, right? What do you see? First approval, 1992, major setback for the field, right? Centoxin gets rejected by the FDA, puts a real cloud over the field. Skip forward to 1997, and Rituxan gets approved. And that period is a special one for me because I was at Biogen in 2002 and then 2003 when we did our tie-up with IDEC. And I got to know and report up into Bill Rastetter and the team out at IDEC, and they would talk about, like, what a slog it was trying to raise money, trying to get partnerships, right? Bill said to me at one point, he's like, I would drive to work every day with the breakup papers for IDEC in my briefcase because we were running out of cash, and, like, I thought it was going to end, and nobody wanted a monoclonal antibody for cancer, right? Not Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then eventually what? He flew all over the globe. Eventually he cut the deal with Genentech, and kind of the rest is history, right? They really took off. Remicade gets approved in 1998. Both products become blockbusters just a few years later, 2002, and we know where monoclonal antibodies are today. They are a cornerstone of the field, right? Very, very important for patients. So if you go back to cell and gene therapy, right? Early 1970s, first concept of gene therapy. Ted Friedman wrote a paper, I think it was in Science, that said, could gene therapies actually work for rare genetic diseases, right? 1972. Skip forward 45 years later, what gets approved? Luxturna, Kymriah, and Yescarta all in 2017. Zolgensma in 2018. Scott Gottlieb in 2019 says we might see 10 to 20 of these things getting approved by 2025. By 2021, Zolgensma becomes a blockbuster product, and the following year, Yescarta, another blockbuster product. And then people may remember when I got up here a year ago, we talked about our 5x5x5. So over a 5-year period of time, we saw 5 gene therapies approved for rare genetic conditions. Pretty good. 5 over 5 years. And then in 2023, we saw 5 in 1 year, right? Like a major burst of innovation, right? A real acceleration for the field. And then this year, what did we see? We saw 9 approvals for cell and gene therapy, which is a record. Now, we do strict scoring here at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. Some will say, well, hang on a second, I thought there were 10. Casgevy did get approved for beta thalassemia, but the team won't let me count that because we only do the first approval. So, you do pull out a little eraser and you can get to 10 pretty efficiently. So either way, we're really knocking on the door of Scott Gottlieb's prediction of 10 a year, which is great for the field and great news for patients. Okay. Questions that we hear about commercialization. And I thought, to start us off, probably some straight talk is helpful and some level setting, right? So to be clear, because sometimes people, fuzz over this a little bit, this first generation of cell therapy and gene editing regimens are often revolutionary, right? The science, the impact on patients, amazing. But nobody claims they are perfect. This generation is not perfect, right? There's some products that are pretty freaking amazing, and there's some that, they're still working through. It's first generation, right? Some, and by the way, very similar to what? Monoclonal antibodies, once upon a time, right? Some face questions around efficacy, some face questions about the safety profile, the durability of response, and some have, complex treatment regimens. They just do, right? And while significant progress is being made around the cost of goods, for some products, they remain stubbornly high. I think as we see greater scale, that will come down, and we're seeing real-world examples of that, which is very encouraging, but it's a truism. And some therapies experience some commercial hurdles as well, right? Including competition in the real world patient dynamics. What's the patient experience really like? Do they want to take a gene therapy themselves or for their child now? Should they wait? I mean, these are very human, real world experiences. And some of the patient populations are very small, right? Okay. Like monoclonal antibodies, like biotech in general, right? So this is not so unique just to cell and gene therapy, I would argue. But that's, I think, at least some helpful level setting. But as I mentioned, they can be truly revolutionary for thousands, and have been, thousands and thousands of patients, right? Suffering from cancer, suffering from rare disorders, right? For those that were able to travel to our meeting on the Mesa in October, right? You may have gotten a chance to hear a remarkable young man, Jimmy Olahair. Jimmy was a sickle cell patient for many years. It had a rough case of it. He ended up in the emergency room countless times a year. He had pain crises that were very difficult to control. He got very desperate, and then he ended up in the Casgevy clinical trial and, received it and immediately felt remarkable. In fact, 4 years to the month after he got Casgevy, he decided he felt so good, he climbed the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro at 19,000 feet. And he is the first, yes, right. Remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. He is the first known sickle cell patient to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, right? Really, really remarkable. I actually saw him at an event in Washington, D.C. Last week on Wednesday, and I'm like, you look great. How do you feel? He's like, I feel like $1 million. Feel great. So, I mean, that is one voice out of thousands that have seen this the power of these transformative therapies, right? So for some, it is truly revolutionary. Okay, Q&A time. Here's the good news. I get to ask the questions, and I get to provide the answers. This is my favorite kind of Q&A. Isn't this great? When you guys are all talking to analysts, they're going to ask you questions, or investors, and you have to provide the answers. I get to do both. So question number one, do cell and gene therapies represent compelling commercial opportunities? The answer is yes. Yes, they do. Okay, let's take a look at some data. So, and this is work that was put together by our friends at Deloitte. And they've kind of foraged into a lot of the Wall Street consensus data and really done a masterful job helping us pull all this together, right? So if you rewind the tape back to 2018, total revenue for cell and gene therapies was $450 million. I mentioned already, Zolgensma and Yescarta come along 2021, 2022, blockbuster products. This year, the Wall Street consensus data suggests that Carvykti from J&J and Elevidys from Sarepta will also become blockbuster products, right? So doubling the number of blockbuster products, and that by 2030 we'll see what? A total of 10 products on the market, right? So we're going to go from 2 to 10 by 2030. Pretty good growth. I think this is one of the, if you could kind of take away one thing from this, one or two things from this presentation, this might be the slide, because beyond that, we see some extremely meaningful products being developed, again, based on the Deloitte analysis of the Wall Street consensus data, right? That will have products that are $500 million or more in revenue. Today, there are 5, and by 2030, that should grow to 30. From 5 to 30. Now, $500 million, $700 million, $800 million products, these are meaningful biotech products, right? Whether you're in biotech, small biotech, certainly big biotech, even, I would argue, pharmaceutical companies. And then further maturation of the field. We'll see today, 75% of the global revenue comes from less than 10 products. That'll move to 50 products by 2030. So again, a big maturation of the field is coming in real time. And then some of these markets are extremely promising, right? Severe sickle cell disease, 25,000 patients. Now, I know some people will say, oh, you look at sickle cell, or maybe you look at hemophilia, or some of these other markets. Wow, it's taken time. Yeah, but if people that have followed this for a while, I mean, when I was looking at sickle cell disease back in 2017, we were like, this is a real market, but it's going to take time, right? These markets are real, but they will take time, in my view. So 25,000 patients in severe sickle cell disease, DMD, 39,000 patients. DEB, right, very difficult Skin condition, 9,000. That's just a sliver of the bigger epidermolysis bullosa patient population, which is much larger. The Crystal and Castle Creek products, of course, are redosable products. And then Danon disease that Rocket is working on, 15 to 30,000 patients, somewhere in there. So some very important markets are out there for us. Okay, question number 2. Are large cap pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical companies investing in cell and gene therapy? The answer is yes. Yes, they are. So we just pulled the data, said, okay, let's take a look at the 15 biggest companies that are out there, right? How many of them are investing, how many of them have active programs in cell and gene therapy? 13 out of the 15, right, are investing in cell and gene therapy right now. How do we know that? A, most of them are members of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. Many of them are on our board. And if they're not a member, we are actively chasing them. The 2 exceptions that I'm aware of are Merck and Amgen. But from Lilly at over $700 billion in market cap to CSL with over $80 billion, they are actively involved in cell and gene therapy. And that's important because they are major drivers of partnerships, right, of M&A, right, of continuing to advance the commercial model globally. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We start with the Novartis Avexis tie-up, right, for SMA, Vertex and CRISPR, Roche, of course, and Sarepta for DMD. And then you have important partnerships like AbbVie and REGENXBIO for wet AMD. Bristol Myers Squibb and Solaris inked this impressive deal to expand their CAR T manufacturing across the US, Europe, and Japan. Aviato Bio and Astellas, an important partnership around frontotemporal dementia. And then Roche and Poseida, I'll talk more about that in a minute, for rare cancers and rare diseases. Okay, last question. Is cell and gene therapy really just a US business? The answer is no, it is not. Let's take a look at the data. All right, so there are significant commercial opportunities outside the US, right? So today, 35% of the worldwide revenue from cell and gene therapy comes outside the US. And with a few of these products, it's greater than 50%, right? Zolgensma at 68% of their revenue comes from outside the United States. Yescarta 54, Kymriah 80%, Luxturna 58, right? So these partnerships are critical. Small biotech companies, yes, will struggle trying to build commercial operations, of course, across Europe, like in any biotech experience. But a lot of these larger companies certainly have the scale, the infrastructure already exists, and we see real-world examples of where it is working, right? And Zolgensma, I mean, again, Zolgensma has been approved for a number of years now. It hit blockbuster status many years ago. I think a lot of people don't understand the success story that well, right? It's approved in 50 markets. They have access established in 45 countries. Again, 68% of their revenue comes from outside the US. Most importantly, over 4,000 young children have benefited from this treatment, and they just put out phase 3 data that indicates they may be able to expand that up to young adults at 18 years of age. Again, it's been a blockbuster since 2001, and it is projected to grow to $2 billion by 2028, right? So a lot of growth. And again, I think it shows the lesson of establishing access capabilities very early in the process to drive a successful commercial model. So a lot of legs still left in Zolgensma. And then, let me talk a little bit about the pipeline and what we see as a pretty bright future. So people may remember we take our data that we do every quarter and we try to update it just in time for JP Morgan. We'll finalize all this, but this is written in sort of dark pencil, our interim 2024 data. So at the bottom, orange represents the total number and the green represents year-over-year growth, right? So despite some headwinds in the capital markets that we're all too familiar with, right, what did we see? Growth in the number of developers, almost 3,000. Growth in the number of clinical trials, almost 2,000. And then importantly, growth in investments up 30% year over year to $15.2 billion. So again, no one's saying there aren't headwinds, but we are seeing important signs of growth. And then people probably have seen, right, in the bigger biotech markets, J&J just announced a $14.5 billion acquisition. I think it was GSK announced a $1 billion acquisition. We may have people in the audience from Tune here. They may have seen, if you are, congratulations to Tune. You're not a member, but we want to get you to become a member of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. They did a $175 million Series B raise, very impressive, right? For what? Epigenetic gene editing. So a gene editing Series B raise for $175 million. And then, again, we saw some important financings and acquisitions. I won't go through all of these, but public financings, yes. VC financing and acquisitions. People probably saw the Roche Poseida tie-up for $1.5 billion in the fourth quarter. Also, Novartis and Kate for $1.1 billion. This is another one of these great myths that gets, it's that old line, what is it? A lie is like, traveling halfway around the world while the truth is getting its boots on, right? Like, how many times do people say, Novartis is really, they're getting out of cell and gene therapy. They turn around, they buy Kate, right? So a lot of these myths and questions are usually one deal away from turning the narrative around on its head, I think, fairly quickly. So just maybe something to keep in mind. And then certainly prevalent diseases are also on the rise, right? We're just seeing the global pipeline continue to advance with some very important disorders, right? I mentioned the AbbVie REGENXBio partnership, right, for wet AMD, right? A slice of that could be addressed of wet AMD through this very important phase 3 program, right? 5.7 million people across US, Europe, and Japan. Parkinson's disease, right? People may have seen the Blue Rock and Bayer news that just came out. So they skipped from a phase 1 trial. Now they're going to be starting a phase 3 trial, right? A big acceleration. So congratulations to Seth and the Blue Rock team and the Bayer team for that. 10 million patients worldwide could be addressed. Multiple sclerosis, right? Another important market, near and dear to my heart from my days at Biogen. 1.5 million people across the US, EU, and Japan. That is in phase 2 with an important trial Kyverna is driving. Type 1 diabetes, 3.8 million people that could be addressed, right? The Vertex and Sana trial. So a lot of very important work being done in these much more prevalent diseases, and this progress is coming our way. What else do we see, right? Some of the top pipeline trends that are driving the cell and gene therapy advancement, right? Progress in solid tumors is very meaningful, right? About 90% of new adult cancer patients, right, are in solid tumors. And the good news is there's over 650 active clinical trials going on right now. Great news for these patients, right? And in 2024, we saw the first approvals from the FDA for cell therapy to treat solid tumors, right? So the future is here, right? There's a lot that's coming, but we're seeing breakthroughs right now, right, which is terrific. CAR T therapies are advancing, right? Earlier treatment options. The CAR Ts for multiple myeloma are continuing to advance as earlier lines of treatment. CAR T is in testing to be a first-line treatment for the first time, right? Like, these are major, highly effective therapies for tough patients with blood cancers, right? And in autoimmune, there's a lot of promise. As I mentioned, several trials are advancing in early to mid-stage trials, including for autoimmune disorders of like lupus, multiple sclerosis, et cetera. And then, there are important milestones for in vivo treatments as well, right? CRISPR is developing in late-stage trials, right? We're seeing the second ever in vivo CRISPR gene editing trial that hits phase 3. Great news there. Also, in vivo CARs are entering the clinic now, right? Groundbreaking work for in vivo CAR Ts and CAR gene therapy concepts as well. So a lot of important advances. Okay, so I think it's helpful, to also spend a few minutes talking about the new administration coming to town. And I first moved to Washington, D.C. right out of college, dating myself, in 1990. I look a lot younger than that, I know, but I got out of college in 1990. And I can tell you, you go back in time, every administration has its headwinds and its tailwinds, right? There are always things that are going well, and there's always things that are going sideways, pretty much with any administration. So we just we kind of rewound the tape to look at Trump 1 and then the Biden administration, right? So if you think about some of the headwinds that existed during the first Trump administration, right? People may remember, right? It was like right around now. It's sort of early in, I think it was January or February. I think it was probably an executive order gets announced about immigration, right? And that, right, put some pressure on people like hey, look, these are knowledge-based workers. How are we gonna handle this, right? So there was a lot around how that could challenge the biotech workforce, right? And you skip towards the end of the Trump administration. There was certainly stuff in between, but they made an attempt to push something called the most favored nation status, which was really to peg drug pricing within Medicare Part B to how they price drugs in other countries, right? It was a proposed rule, eventually collapsed, fell apart, didn't take effect, right? But, some headwinds there. There were some tailwinds, right? Like, I think most people would acknowledge the appointment of Scott Gottlieb was like a terrific choice. He ended up being a terrific FDA commissioner, certainly for cell and gene therapy, right, from 2017 and 2019. And there was a proposed rule that they did a fantastic job. It eventually got finalized in the Biden administration, but that would really kind of enable outcomes-based arrangements in both the commercial setting and in Medicaid by working through things like Medicaid best price, right? So something the industry really lobbied for. We were delighted when this proposed rule came out. So good tailwinds there, right? The Biden administration, right? The passage of the IRA and related price controls, major headwind, right? Inflation, right? And rising interest rates put a lot of downward pressure on the capital markets, as you all have experienced, right, the last few years. And then an aggressive FTC, the posture of the FTC, right, not super conducive to important combinations and tie-ups, right? And, people have argued may have placed some downward pressure on biotech M&A, right? On the other hand, right, like a high philosophical alignment with the president and the White House on cancer, right? The cancer moonshot was an important initiative. And then this cell and gene therapy, CMMI's cell and gene therapy access model, which both Vertex and Bluebird have embraced. It's playing out right now. I think states have until the end of February to finalize an agreement with CMMI, but this looks like it could be a major step forward for advancing the commercial model. Think about like half of the gene therapy, gene editing patient populations are probably in Medicaid, something around that order, right? Depends on the disease, could be more, sickle cell's higher, some it's gonna be less. But thinking about how do we modernize Medicaid to embrace cell and gene therapies is a major advance for our field. So a major tailwind there. And then, what do we see by way of, again, I'm just trying to play out some fair balance with what we see coming for the next few years, some potential real opportunities that could work for cell and gene therapy, right? So I would argue there is a strong philosophical alignment with aspects of the Make America Healthy Again posture by addressing the root cause of diseases and trying to get away from chronic care, right? The pills of the past at some level. We also see, the continuity around the outstanding efforts and work product that Peter Marks and Nicole Verdun have really begun and have been driving the last few years, right? Peter will speak to this in a moment, but the feedback I hear from people is the flexibility that they've shown, the ability to take small trials, right, and just say, let's keep going and allow us to advance things that's the kind of regulatory flexibility that we love to see. The use of accelerated approvals appropriately. Peter obviously has been very strong on that front, as is his team. And then there's a lot of efforts around platform technologies, including gene editing as a platform that we think really represent the future of medicine. We want to see a continuation of the CMMI access model that I touched on a moment ago, right? And then the strengthening of U.S. manufacturing capacity here in the U.S. We think is very important. That's part of a little bit of the America First, whether people are bringing things back to the U.S. or back to Europe from other parts of the world. We think that could be certainly positive. And then look, new leadership within the Federal Trade Commission, a different philosophy there, I think would be more helpful for M&A in the field, right? So while we all want to realize there's going to be plenty of headwinds that are going to come, like in any administration, I think it's also helpful to think about what could be helpful tailwinds along the way. Okay, so, in summary, I think history can oftentimes provide, sometimes an imperfect, but nevertheless a helpful guide when we're thinking about things, right? The path of things like monoclonal antibodies, certainly the path of cell and gene therapy is not a straight line. It is not a straight line. We know that. But it's moving in the right direction and will continue to move in the right direction. There are a lot of blockbusters out there, and there are other very important and meaningful products behind them that are coming. Science continues to evolve and develop. It's very breathtaking. And then we're seeing these systems modernize, which is great news. All right. With that, let me say thank you. And I think we're going to beam in Peter Marks. But before I turn it over to Peter, I do want to say a special thanks to Form Bio, one of our sponsors, and Ohio Discovery Corridor for making this meeting possible. And again, a shout out to our partners at Deloitte for all their help with the data. Okay, thank you very much.